Burger King. How may I help you?
Yeah, I'd like some pork. All of your pork, please.
Alrighty, will this be on?
Yep. Look, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. We don't really eat pork, but I just read this verse in Mark chapter 7 that says that Jesus declared all foods clean, so now I'd like some pork.
Alright, that'll be $11.20. First one, so please, no onion, no pickles.
What? Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. We need to talk about Mark chapter 7, because this text gets brought up a lot in conversations people have with Adventists. What does Mark mean when he writes that Jesus declared all foods clean? I mean, isn't the plain reading, the simplest reading of this text, that all of those clean and unclean distinctions we find in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 are done away with? Well, I'd say that simple explanations are to be preferred, but they are not always sufficient. In Luke 10:19, for instance, Jesus assures his followers that they have the authority to trample snakes and scorpions and that nothing will harm you. Now, the simplest, plainest explanation for that verse is that you're invincible. And yet Jesus suffered and died, and he also assured those of us who follow him that we will undergo suffering as well. So when the simplest explanation doesn't quite make sense, we have to look for more nuanced explanations. And that's what I believe we have to do in Mark 7 as well. Because if Jesus truly had made all things clean, then why do we never see them, like him or the disciples, eating anything unclean? Why does Peter boast in Acts chapter 10, I have never eaten anything impure or unclean? Why does the Council of Jerusalem urge Gentile believers not to eat blood in their meat, a prohibition given to the Jews back in Leviticus 17? Now, maybe there are explanations for all of those texts, but my point is that when the plain reading of one text conflicts with the plain reading of other texts, we need to look for more nuanced understandings of these texts. On the face of it, this plain reading of Mark 7 verse 19 contradicts these other texts, and so we have to dive a little deeper in order to understand what's going on here. So, if you need to go ahead and read Mark 7 to refresh your memory of what this is all about, I'll wait. Go ahead. Okay, done? So why don't I believe that Jesus was getting rid of these kosher laws here in Mark 7 verse 19? Let me give you a few reasons. First, doesn't pass the smell test. Let's reflect upon the significance of the claim that Jesus dismantled a huge part of the Mosaic law in the middle of an argument with the Pharisees. Okay, Jesus didn't stand up and say, I have something important to tell everybody. No, the Pharisees brought up a minor point, and we are to believe that Jesus only brought up this earth-shattering charge as a response to them. Now, if they never would have asked Jesus about washing hands, would he never have told us that this whole kosher thing is done away with? That seems unlikely. Jesus, even in this passage, never would have even brought up this issue, except that the disciples had privately asked him what he meant later on. And that's an important point, because even the disciples didn't get what Jesus was saying, so they asked Jesus to explain it to them. And even after Jesus explained it to them again, Mark apparently still had to tell the readers what Jesus meant by those words. That would be like the United States president saying something and the reporter's not understanding it. So they ask him again. They still don't get it. So later on, his press secretary says, oh, by the way, we're at war with China. I mean, is that really how we would expect such monumental news to be delivered? Now, Christians often approach these textual issues from their Christian perspective and, in the words of one scholar, read the text backwards. Because most Christians don't keep kosher, they tend to look for interpretations in the text which justify this conclusion. And so, as Daniel Boyarin writes, as read by most commentators, Mark 7 established the beginning of the so-called parting of ways between Judaism and Christianity. This is because, according to the traditional interpretation, and virtually all modern scholarly ones, in this chapter Jesus declares a major aspect of the Torah's laws, the keeping of kashrut, that is, keeping kosher, no longer valid, thus representing a major rupture with the beliefs and practices of virtually all other Jews, Pharisaic or not. I think we would be naive to think that Jesus could have destroyed such an important component of the Pentateuch and just walked away without any repercussions, without any additional controversy. To me, that just doesn't pass the smell test. My second reason is that Mark 7 has nothing to do with kosher laws. Ike Mueller's groundbreaking dissertation on this passage in 2015 makes an excellent case that Leviticus 11 can be broken up into major sections. Verses 1 to 23 deal with clean and unclean meats, that is, animals that you eat, while verses 24 to 40 deal with what he calls touch contamination, that is, becoming unclean by the things you touch. And there are different levels of severity here. Breaking some of these purity laws would get you kicked out of the community of Israel, which is the ultimate consequence someone can face. Now, these touch contamination laws were mild by comparison, and sometimes they were even unavoidable. If a lizard crawled into your jar and died, your jar would be unclean until evening. And if you had to pick up said dead lizard and throw it away, then you would also be unclean until evening as well. What's clear is that the debate in Mark 7 is about clean and unclean touch, not clean and unclean food. The Pharisees were concerned that you could go to your Walmart and touch something that was unclean, perhaps without knowing it, and then you go pick up the food you're buying, you come home and you eat it, and your unclean hands have made your clean food to be unclean also. And since you ate it, now you're unclean too, and you may not even know it. That's why you have to wash your hands before every meal just to be safe. Now, no one in this chapter is talking about pigs or any other kind of unclean animal. The laws which the Pharisees or the rabbis or whoever invented were clearly inspired by that second section of Leviticus 11, the section on touch contamination, not the first section about clean and unclean animals. In fact, Mueller points out that the word Mark uses here, koinos, is a distinct category of purity that, and I quote him here, has no background in the Hebrew Bible and is first mentioned in the Second Temple period in 1 Maccabees 1, verse 47. Now, these koinos laws were certainly inspired by the touch contamination laws in Leviticus, but as Jesus pointed out in Mark 7, they are not God's laws, and in fact, a rather clever way of rejecting God's laws. And this is what Jesus was getting at in this chapter. So that leads me to my third and final reason for rejecting this common interpretation of Jesus' words, and that's that it misses the point of the story in Mark 7. How did a conversation about ritual hand washing become what the scholar Yair Furstenberg claims is Jesus as annulling not only Pharisaic law and tradition, but also the commandments that appear in the Bible itself? This extreme conclusion, he writes, unthinkable in other gospel sources, has caused some scholars to divest Jesus of these words. In fact, what he means here is that some people can't even believe that Jesus would have said such a thing, so they have to conclude, well, Jesus, there's no way he would have even said this. There's no way he would have challenged these laws, right? Yeah. Well, Jesus wasn't dealing with all types of impurity in this chapter, but a very specific type, that of something being unclean because you touched it and then made you unclean by eating it. And as both Mueller and Furstenberg tell us, these hand-washing laws were innovations. They don't have roots in the Hebrew Bible. So what Jesus is rejecting here isn't biblical purity laws, but these bonus laws that had been relatively recently invented and which even came to challenge biblical purity laws. Let me explain. The NIV translation of Mark 7:19 is misleading, but let's assume it's accurate for the sake of argument. Okay, it says, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. And I ask, clean for what purpose? Clean to touch? Clean to eat? Jesus had just finished saying that the food you touch will go into your stomach and then eventually into the sewer. So maybe Mark means that Jesus declared all foods clean when they leave your body. But I think it's best to adhere to Jesus' larger point in this passage. And so I think you could interpret Mark 7:19 something like this. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean, which the Pharisees had declared unclean. Now, I favor this interpretation of the text because of Acts 10, where Peter has this vision of all kinds of animals together on a sheet. Presumably, there were clean as well as unclean animals here. But Peter refused the invitation to go and kill an animal because, as he said, he had never eaten anything unclean. For Peter, the clean animals had become unclean by touching or being near the unclean ones. And that, indeed, was a common rabbinic teaching in Jesus' day, but it isn't in the Pentateuch. A cow is ceremonially clean to eat, even if it's in a pig pen. But not to the Pharisees and not to Peter. And Peter reflects this tradition in how he acts in this vision. And this is why Jesus is so upset in Mark chapter 7. In effect, the Pharisees were declaring things unclean, which God had declared clean. After all, you can find in the Talmud, talks about unclean drinks, which is a category never found in the Pentateuch. And if Jesus was upset that the Pharisees were declaring that clean things were now unclean, what might he say to Christians who are declaring that unclean things are now clean? And that's the great irony of how the vast majority of Christians interpret this passage today. They're doing exactly what the Pharisees in this story were doing, except in reverse. Jesus wasn't destroying the law in this passage. He was protecting it from those well-meaning believers whose traditions were nevertheless compromising the integrity of the law. So yeah, that's how I take Mark 7 verse 19. I guess I don't get to eat pork after all. Oh well.